If you live in the UK, you've probably noticed some interesting restrictions that appear on certain websites now, demanding that you verify your age. That's because the 2023 Online Safety Act has come into force and has predictably become such a fiasco that now Wikipedia might be blocked or have limited access in the UK. Wikipedia recently lost a challenge in the courts against the law. Between this and the other types of obvious problems this law has, both in its text and in its implementation, I have some questions and I have some thoughts. I'm going to do my best to bring you up to speed if you are fortunate enough to live outside of the UK, and God, do I think you're fortunate at the moment, and to help all of us understand the political background that led to this and why that makes everything about this law even worse, which might surprise you, but it is actually possible for this to be worse, which is surprising when a law has a petition with over 500,000 signatures asking for it to be repealed. It will be of no surprise to you if you live in the UK that the government's response to the petition is no. There's been a pretty long-running, low-scale drama playing out about the role of the internet in people's lives, and most crucially, for politicians and journalists, how that impacts our society. This has led to some interesting, if we're going to be polite about it, propositions about changing the way the internet is regulated and what should be required to do or say certain things. A particularly comical example that didn't come into force, but is somewhat related to the main topic here, is that there was a plan suggested to require over 18s to purchase a physical token in order to access adult content. Like, you would have to go to your local off license and buy some kind of object that means you have that would just verify that you were over 18. Like, at that point, just buy a magazine, right? Now, as funny as it is to imagine, this was a component of a planned policy for way longer than it should have been. This speaks to a bigger issue, which is that politicians and the people advising them don't know anything about how anything works. We'll be pulling on that thread multiple times in this video. Will it surprise you to know that? I don't know. Another example that I think is relevant here, given the website's impacted already by this, is the long-running issue of politicians wanting to make online anonymity illegal. I did a video about this a long time ago, feel free to check that out, but it's an old video, it's a very different presentation style. But the main point here is that politicians who want this are wrong. They're also largely motivated by a resentment towards social media, allowing direct criticism of them, which they have often conflated with abuse. That's not to say that some members of parliament don't have legitimate grievances. Often excluded from these discussions is Diane Abbott, the MP who in 2017 got 50% of all abuse sent to female MPs, who was also on the record as supporting the end of online anonymity because of all the racist abuse she gets. Now, she's still wrong to want this, but she's wrong for the right reason, if that makes sense. My simple proposition to anyone who thinks ending online anonymity would fix this problem is that they need to explain why Facebook, which requires real names, is like that. It also once again betrays a lack of understanding of how this all works, but we'll leave it there. You understand where I'm coming from. The internet and restrictions or impositions upon users and websites have been discussed over and over again, and the prevailing consensus has become something must be done, which, as we all know, means that something, even if it's really unworkable and total nonsense, is likely going to be done. Speaking of total nonsense, let's try to figure out what the stated intent behind this bill was. I went looking through Hansard, because you know I'm such a cool person, and it turns out this was introduced by Nadine Dorries, which maybe goes some way to explaining why this is such a fiasco. When she introduced this law at the second reading, she said that this was part of fulfilling the Conservatives' manifesto promise to make the UK the safest place in the world to be online, especially for children. This is a powerful line that immediately disarms a lot of potential criticism, which is why it's survived multiple changes of both Secretary of State and Prime Minister. Because let's be honest with each other, Who wants to be on the record as wanting to make children less safe? Which gave the law a lot of cover to be maximalist in ways that it might not otherwise have been if it was subjected to basic, informed scrutiny prior to being passed, or if the opposition had felt any need to actually construct a basic understanding of these issues without fear of being called, well, we'll see in a second, but you can probably imagine what opponents of the law have been called. An example is Peter Kyle, and yes, that is his name, and I am aware of what it sounds like, accusing Reform leader Nigel Farage of being on the side of Jimmy Savile and predators for opposing this law. Now, don't get me wrong, Nigel Farage and Reform are being completely transparent opportunists here. That's still an absolutely absurd escalation that illustrates the power of that line. The accusations even said that he was on the side of extreme pornographers, which, yeah, that kind of makes Nigel Farage sound really cool, actually. But also, this is the reason why I don't take this seriously. It's not just that, as we'll see, this doesn't protect children and that there are open admissions that this wasn't about protecting children. Like, I challenge anyone in support of this law to explain why someone should have to scan their ID or face to listen to Spotify. I'm sorry, I'm just not buying it. The fact is, the government is trying to force this through because of the ultimate truth. No one wants to be the political wing of jerking off. It's just not a good position to be in politically, and to be honest, there are a lot of jokes to be made about Farage becoming that. I'll leave that to the centrists, though, all of those clever centrist parody accounts. They can go and have fun with that, because as much as he's a bigoted, opportunist scam artist who doesn't really care about this issue, his opposition to this act is the correct position. He's right about it, but for the wrong reason. Because none of this really works, and it was super predictable that it would turn out to be unworkable bullshit. Let's be honest, the Online Safety Act is a farce. It's not just that it doesn't work, it can't work. It's not really enforceable, it's open to ludicrous levels of interpretation by platforms whose responsibility it is to enforce this law, lest they face a very significant fine. And the parts the government is really interested in are grotesque violations of people's privacy. How does this happen? Because to me, it's one thing if a law has a sound understanding of the technicalities and is passed, and then it turns out there are flaws and loopholes and misapplications of that law and so on. That's fixable. It's embarrassing for the government that passed it and the one that's implementing it, but you could almost look at that as a well-intentioned, informed mistake and sort of go, yeah, that happens sometimes. We're not monsters. We understand these things. Instead, what we have is a law that doesn't work on every level, both in stated intent and in what I suspect its true intent was. The obvious reason this happens is that members of Parliament are just not informed people. Westminster, both in the Commons and the Lords, draws upon a particular type and class of person disproportionately, and partisan loyalty is ruthlessly enforced. So even if a member of Parliament understood the issues, it doesn't matter. There's an Evan Edinger? Sorry, don't know which way that goes, video where he talks about the Online Safety Act that I quite liked. For my purposes, I draw your attention to the section where he talks about MPs trying to explain how VPNs work. I'll drop a link in the description. That really illustrates the depth of the challenge of getting MPs to understand how these things work. Now, it's not just this, because this law is deliberately vague and deliberately empowers platforms for reasons we'll get into, but if we're taking politicians at their word and we're accepting the premise that this is about making children safer, let's see if that holds water with how we know the act works. Let's return to the issue of VPNs. Don't worry, this is not a segue into an ad. No one is foolish enough to sponsor me. If you've watched a YouTube video in the past 5 years, you know how a VPN works well enough. It allows you to conceal where you're accessing a website from. So if you're from Britain, you can appear as if you're from a country that doesn't have weirdly draconian restrictions on the internet. If you wanted to get a VPN, by my estimate, it'd take around 5 to 6 clicks and a well-targeted search to install one, meaning you could easily circumvent any restrictions. We'll pivot back to how trivial this is in a bit, but for now let's consider the reaction to this obvious issue. In opposition, when the law was being passed by the Tories, Labour did suggest banning VPNs. The idea died almost as soon as it was uttered, I suspect because tech sector lobbyists screamed at them, but we don't know that for sure, so we'll have to leave it. In the wake of the law's ham-fisted implementation, this idea has been floated again by the Children's Commissioner for England, and we've had ministers pleading with the public to not use VPNs. If the information about how often they've been searched for is accurate, I'm going to go ahead and suggest that the British public are not doing the government that favour. All of this while MPs are paying for VPNs on expenses. It's a bit rich to accuse the British public of being dangerous to children because they want to avoid scanning their faces or their IDs for a dodgy verification company to analyse, especially in the wake of a number of incidents around children's safety that have occurred in the Labour Party. For example, it has ranged from ex-MPs to sitting councillors to senior members of staff for the Health Secretary to members of the Scottish Parliament, all the way to currently sitting members of Parliament, not to mention the party leader's own perceived record on this matter not being entirely unblemished, depending on how you interpret his time at the Crown Prosecution Service. It can't be any surprise that a government that lacks authority in general and specifically on children's safety is being roundly ignored, especially when they're proposing something that's technically impossible without disrupting the entire economy. So many systems rely on VPNs of some kind, and sure, the government could make a carve-out for legitimate use, but do we believe that they'll manage that without fucking it into the sun? Just think about that for a second. Let's sort of ignore the specific technical aspects of it and just think about it on a basic practical level, because most people are not elbow deep into being good at technology. I say this as someone with a job in tech. Most people only reliably know what they need to know to do what they want. If you don't know what to do, you'll just find a way to do it. And I think we're underestimating children and the general public here, which I find especially odd because there are members of Parliament who are around my age, younger even, if you can believe it, and they must have had the classic IT class experience of getting around all of the filters to play Flash games. Okay, I gave away my age there, but you know what? It's not really a secret at this point. But you understand what I mean. Why are we assuming that children won't find it trivially easy to get around this stuff? If they want to look at something, watch something, access something, and they're determined to do it, then they will do it. An interesting example of where these restrictions failed is in Turkey, where they implemented much more draconian and harsh restrictions blocking websites entirely. And I can tell you, as someone who spent a lot of time there, everyone knew how to get around it. My grandmother knew how to get around it. Like, that's how commonplace this knowledge was. I've seen ways to get around age verification that frankly astonished me in how weak these verification systems were. From fake IDs, using the Prime Minister's face, to using the character creator in video games to dupe the facial recognition. It strikes me as obvious that people will just find a way to access what they want or what they're habitually accessing. When that becomes too much of an encumbrance, then it forces people to look to dangerous solutions. For example, not all VPNs are created equal. Some harvest your data. Some make extravagant promises that could compel you to lower your guard online. But none of this would be relevant, or at least it'd be less of an issue if the UK government hadn't created a boom market for this. We're now faced with the choice between potentially compromising our security one way in order to circumvent an unjust law, or almost certainly doing it if we obey it and want to use the internet as we've always done up to now. To say nothing of how this is forcing people who want to access content onto websites that maybe don't comply with British law at all. We run the risk of pushing people into more and more dangerous and risky situations, especially children, all because this government and the last one really didn't care about children's safety. There has been a chilling effect that's amounted to the policing of adults and their political activity, which some believe, I think naively, is an unintended consequence. To me, from where I sit, and from the ways this political debate has evolved over the past decade, maybe longer, it's deliberate. By now it's pretty obvious this isn't about the children. There was an article in the Times that pretty much torpedoed this, and while I'm loath to quote the Times, I did find this particular quote taken from a High Court judgment interesting and relevant to it all. The quote was that the law was about regulating services that have a significant influence over public discourse. In other words, this is about policing adults and not children, as I said earlier, especially when part of this has been about online trolls, who could be children, but given how broad the definition of troll has become in British political parlance, it's probably just your average 37-year-old frustrated office worker telling an MP they're shit at their job. Which, in fairness, they usually are. In fact, speaking of MPs who are bad at their job, Labour MP Emily Darlington, which I cannot believe is a real name, did us all a favour and posted her article in The Telegraph onto Blue Sky as a series of screenshots where the headline invoked the idea of parents' peace of mind. And before we get into how ridiculous her arguments are here, with almost none of it having anything to do with activities covered by the Online Safety Act, this raised an eyebrow for me. Setting aside the tension that can exist between children's safety and parents' peace of mind, I just struggle to find this at all credible. A law that's forcing both adults and children to act in more dangerous ways to engage in their normal day-to-day activity shouldn't give parents peace of mind, especially in the context of a government that's betting the house on AI to fix everything. I find it really interesting that recently there's been an incident of an AI chatbot trying to engage in inappropriate activities with a user it believed was 14 years old, using John Cena's voice. Which, if I was John Cena, maybe I'd be considering my life choices at this point. Just a thought, you know? I bring this up because Peter Kyle, the minister responsible for implementing the Online Safety Act and who's been out trying to defend it, is big into AI. In fact, if you look at his register of interests, you can find multiple entries where he's had staff seconded to him from AI-related firms or AI-positive firms. Now, might these staff have had some kind of impact on his decisions related to AI and regulating it, and what parts of the internet he regulates, and what parts he adopts a laissez-faire attitude to? I'll leave that to your judgment, because you don't need me to handhold you to that conclusion. Also, it's interesting that he's received donations from the Tony Blair Institute, named after a guy who's famously big into mandatory ID. I'm not saying anything once again, just pointing it out. He's also a guy, as I recall, who's big into AI. So, you know. It is nonetheless curious that the risks associated with AI chatbots and the like are not a central concern for a government whose members are seemingly in bed with the firms who are invested in it. I'm not saying that social media and the rest of the internet is risk-free, or that AI should be regulated necessarily in the same way as the Online Safety Act demands, because given how it's being forced into everything, how would you police AI like that, right? So excuse me if I'm possibly a little skeptical about this being about parents' peace of mind or children's safety, because it doesn't provide either, or it shouldn't provide peace of mind at the very least. In fact, one of the potential effects of this is that it can make age-appropriate resources and resources for parents potentially impossible to access, all for the sake of trying to give parents a way to avoid the difficult work of parenting. Now, there are resources out there, and the last time I checked, this was still accessible without any Online Safety Act nonsense. I would recommend Bish, run by a friend of the channel, Justin Hancock. Given the age demographics on the channel, I will provide a link to the resources he has for parents while you can still access it from the UK. Make the most of it. Bish does provide an interesting case study. It's funded by patrons, much like this channel, but we'll get to that later as well. And it's a website that might fall victim to this if it's categorized in a certain way under the Act. I don't know that it could be accessible from the UK in that case. They certainly can't, with an income of £4,000 to £5,000 a year, afford third-party verification. These are resources that could actually help you as a parent get peace of mind and help children be safe. Instead, we're potentially hiding these resources and other resources that contribute to either people's enjoyment, information, or their health. This was never going to stop at adult content, and I say that with the biggest air quotes imaginable, or content that could be construed as adult. It was always going to be interpreted broadly. Every attempt to reshape the internet in this fashion has been, and to go back to a couple of examples I mentioned earlier, I don't see how that can be denied when I have to submit an ID to listen to Papa Roach, which I find offensive because there's no way anyone under 18 is listening to that band. So, can we please get our shit together, actually? Also, the Wikipedia issue looms large in my mind. It wasn't so long ago that censorship of Wikipedia was the preserve of tin pot dictators, not supposedly evolved liberal democratic societies. It's also hit addiction-related websites and forums, with some preferring to block certain functionality or the website entirely to UK users. This has led to one of the worst arguments from a government source I've ever seen. I'm going to read you the article as written. This official, who remained anonymous, was quoted saying that companies were being overzealous in their application of the law, perhaps intentionally, to undermine its credibility. Whose fault is that? Of course tech companies are going to be overzealous when you actually threaten them with substantial fines if you don't degrade their users' experience. You gave them an excuse to inshitify, and they took it because of course they did. I have no sympathy for this line of complaint. This is plainly the fault of both the government who passed the law and the government trying to implement it. Anyone could have told you that they would have done this, and yeah, I suspect it is to undermine the law's credibility, because the law is fucking shit. Everyone knew it. There was a reason the Tories kept delaying implementation. It's because they knew it was shit. If you have one of the largest working majorities in modern British history, you can amend or repeal the law, and then you don't have to deal with the companies deliberately undermining you. This has also empowered platforms who get to choose what content on their sites constitutes adult content, and it will be of no surprise to some of you that this has resulted in videos from Palestine and Ukraine being censored, which leads to an interesting set of contradictions. For example, if a 16-year-old wanted to, they could buy a newspaper or go to their website and read about these events, perhaps including the images that are blocked. Now, you'll likely have the same thoughts as I do on this hypothetical, which is that the chance of a 16-year-old wanting to buy a newspaper or go to their website is pretty marginal. Why do I mention 16-year-olds here specifically? Well, that's because the government plans to give them the vote, which is fine. I support that. But it's rather interesting that the government has then handed this power to tech companies to censor, because it has resulted in not just the two most significant foreign policy issues in the UK being blocked from view, but also in the blocking of a video that tells people how to join the new left-wing party that's supposed to be formed soon, TM. Whole other thing, let's just leave that to one side for this moment. Which raises the question, how can we reconcile this notion that 16 and 17-year-olds are going to be enfranchised across the UK, but are also unable to see relevant news and information about political parties that are relevant to how they might vote? In fact, this censorship will likely extend to other places like Sudan and the DRC. I haven't heard of posts from there being censored, but how can we say they'll make an informed decision, or as informed a decision as the rest of the electorate, if fascist dickhead Elon Musk or whatever prick owns your social media platform of choice blocks whatever they think is inconvenient. We've quite literally handed tech companies a sledgehammer to crack a very, very small nut, and it's created a dissonant position with lots of obvious asymmetries that are impossible to justify. Speaking of an asymmetry that's impossible to justify, what you're seeing on screen right now is me not using a VPN, accessing a gambling website on the 20th of August. For those of you unaware, you need to be over 18 in order to gamble in the UK. As you can see, I can freely access the site, browse freely, look at some odds for Filipino basketball, and just a whole host of other things without once having to verify my identity. Now, you might say, SK, you need to register and confirm your age in order to actually gamble, and you're not wrong. I'm not saying you should have to scan your face to look at some odds. You could walk down any high street in the UK, find a betting shop, and see the odds on a football match or whatever. It is nonetheless hard to justify, given the law is being interpreted in a way that means totally legal activities like listening to music with a swear word in it or trying to find support for addiction are now being made harder to do by this, especially in light of how close the Labour Party is to the gambling lobby. If you remember a lot of those really nasty right-wing Labour MPs from the 2010s, a lot of them ended up with the gambling lobby. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, it's just kind of interesting, isn't it? Even if we extend this to adult content, I can't browse that content with anywhere near as much freedom as I could if I was looking up the odds on Filipino basketball, which I'm sure is very entertaining, it's just not my thing. Even if we wanted to comply with the law's requirements to provide ID or other age verification like a face scan, which I'm not sure if you're watching at this point, you do want to do, there are a number of issues. For one, the individual platform is responsible for picking out a third party or creating their own process to verify this, which has created a new captive market for data processing. And there's no guarantee that these companies will be secure with our data, especially if their local laws compel them in some fashion to store data for a fixed period. It would be one thing if the onus was on the government to provide the verification. Say there was like a .gov.uk platform where you scanned your passport and it granted you access on every website. This would still be bad because it would tie your, IP address or your specific accounts, which are then tied to your physical ID, meaning all it'd take is a government data leak and suddenly every anime avatar account is outed to everyone. And these government data leaks happen surprisingly often in the UK, often with a laptop being left on a train or something. So it's not a minor concern, even in this idealized hypothetical. This is nothing short of a nightmare. While entities outside the UK and EU are required to comply with GDPR, provided the information originates in these regions, do we trust a platform called Kids Web Services, which is being used by Blue Sky for age verification, to handle our data? I'm not alleging anything specific about them, but just the name and look of it alone makes me question whether they're going to handle it properly. As PC Gamer, and yeah, I know, I didn't realize they were still a thing either, points out, there's a pretty big risk here, detailed in their article about this. More worryingly still, the possibility for massive illegal data collection through spoofed websites or age assurance pop-ups, those made to look authentic but are not. A user may be misled to uploading their ID passport or provide a facial scan to a system that is designed to steal that information and leverage it against the user through identity theft or blackmail. And I would suggest blackmail is definitely a risk here, and if you're not worried about blackmail, then tell me what you looked up on your last incognito or private browser session. If you won't tell me, then you probably understand why this is a catastrophe waiting to happen. Which does bring me to the crux of why this is really concerning to me and probably to you, which is that this is transparently about remodeling the internet and policing the behavior of law-abiding adults in the context of the long-running disputes over the role of social media and the general public in politics, this can't really be seen as anything other than a step towards tying real identities to people's online presence. I did a video a long time ago, as I mentioned, about online anonymity. And one of the things that emerged when I was doing that was just how dangerous it is to force people's identities to be tied to their online presence this way. To even allow the possibility, whether through a spoof or a scam, or through a data leak, or even a future law that builds on this, it risks ruining lives, all for no real gain in online safety other than for MPs and journalists who want to contact people's bosses because they called them a helmet on X.com or on Blue Sky. When you see the consequences of handing big tech this sledgehammer, the censorship, the dissonant results, the chilling effect it has on expression, an assault is currently taking place on multiple fronts against expression. I would point out particularly LGBTQ plus expression at the moment. Frankly, we have an obligation to stand up to this. This is all part of the same whole. These are not unintended consequences. They are very much intended consequences. The restrictions on expression and on free speech in the name of safety that isn't even being delivered is intolerable. Even if safety was being delivered, it would still be intolerable, especially when combined with how facile the political dialogue has been on this. One of the things that stood out is just how pathetic the lines of argument in favor of this have been. In particular, the excuses that have been made. I just can't stop thinking about that government source who complained about how tech companies were interpreting the law. If a law is unclear, that's your fault as the government. You handed the tech companies a sledgehammer and they're using it because of course they are. It's just pathetic from a majority government, or really any government at all. And I hate this sense that they were powerless. They knew when the law was coming into force. They were in opposition when the law was passed. They had every opportunity to challenge it and change it, and they didn't. So it sucks to suck, I guess. Then I returned to that Emily Darlington article, making up a complete fan fiction where none of the things she catastrophizes about is prevented by the act she was trying to defend. It's actually insulting how badly she does here. I'll have a link to her post where she made the article available, but it's illiterate nonsense, and it speaks to how embarrassing this really is, that she's not even the one who comes off the worst in this entire situation. Peter Kyle, whose name I am trying desperately not to make fun of here, he wanted to be front and center in this discussion and accused Nigel Farage and opponents of this law of being on the side of predators like Jimmy Savile. Jess Phillips, the Rent-A-Gob MP, also repeated this. Where Labour gets the brass neck to make this kind of accusation, I don't know. You'd think if you were in a party led by Keir Starmer, they'd be telling you never mention Jimmy Savile, especially given the number of people who have credible accusations against them in their own party. This isn't just insulting to the victims of Jimmy Savile, it betrays a worrying misunderstanding of how he got away with what he did. He did all of his crimes prior to the wide proliferation of the internet. He wielded his celebrity status and his connections with the British establishment, including the royal family, to get away with his crimes. How would the Online Safety Act have prevented that? It's only the miracle of Peter Kyle's accusation being met with one of the most poorly produced demands for an apology we've ever seen that saved the government from total humiliation here.
So, Mr. Kyle, can I have an apology, please?
That's not to say that Nigel Farage is the good guy here or that there aren't cynical actors, but the government should just make the case for what's happening under the law they were happy to implement. The purpose of the system is what it does, so the government should defend that. The censorship, the monitoring, the security risks, all of it. If they can't, and they resort to slandering anyone who uses a VPN as putting children's safety at risk, then fuck them. They clearly know this law is indefensible. What can we actually do about this? The petition is going to be rejected. If a date for the debate is set, email your MP and ask them to attend, or at least state their position in a reply to you. A lot of MPs are sitting on wafer-thin majorities, and the political system is in upheaval. They will be particularly sensitive to pressure, and even if your MP disagrees with you, tell them to go to the debate because it will give you good material to use against them at the next election. Otherwise, you're smart enough to know how to get around these things, and you don't need me to encourage you. I think about a piece of advice my dad would give me whenever I called him while I was at uni. Be good, but if you can't be good, be safe. I think it's very applicable here, and I'll catch you all on the next video. Peace. So, I need to thank my proofreader, who once again read this on the night. Thank you to her. And I would also like to say, if you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, subscribe. Tell me about the worst way that the Online Safety Act has impacted you. I'm really interested to hear about that. Maybe we could do a follow-up where I dunk on it again if there's a lot of good comments in that regard. But I also want to thank the patrons and members who have really stuck by me. I've not really felt myself recently. Some of you will be privy to that, some of you won't be, but I've really not felt like myself recently, which is why there's been a lack of videos. Thank you to the patrons and members, and of course to all of you who are already subscribed for sticking with me through that. It's just been a terrible couple of months for me, and I've not been myself, and I'm starting to find my way back. But I want to give a special shout out to the top tier patrons: Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kersley Scheider, John N, Liron, Jar Jar Muba, and Carolyn. Absolute legends. And also a special shout out to our YouTube members: Nadi Jiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, Scaly Bubble, Ben Johnson. If you want to get the videos early, if you want to vote on the topics of videos, if you want just a whole host of benefits and to just sort of know what's going on, the Patreon and the YouTube membership are there for you. Please join if you're able. If not, a like, a subscribe, a comment. Those are free and very appreciated. Thank you very much, and I will catch you all in the next video.